Howdy do, and welcome to the final day of A Wrinkle in Time. So today's focus is to give the book a critique. What did you think of the book? And remember, focus on story elements. Focus on things like character development, problem and solution. Focus on things like dialogue, how well the author did in helping you visualize and ask questions and infer all those good things. So the final conclusion. Immediately, Meg was swept into darkness, into nothingness, and then into the icy devouring cold of the black thing. Mrs. Witch won't let it get me, she thought over and over, while the cold of the black thing seemed to crunch at her bones. Then they were through it, and she was standing breathlessly on her feet on the same hill on which they had first landed on Camazotz. She was cold and a little numb, but no worse than she'd often been in the winter of the country when she'd spent an afternoon skating in the pond. She looked around. She was completely alone. Her heart began to pound. Then, seeming to echo from all around her, came Mrs. Witch's unforgettable voice. "I have not given you my gift. You have something that it has not. This is something, it is your only weapon, but you mustn't find it. You must find it, for yourself." Then the voice ceased, and Meg knew she was alone. She walked slowly down the hill, her heart thumping painfully against her ribs. There below her was the same row of identical houses that they had seen before, and beyond these the linear buildings of the city. She walked along the quiet street. It was dark, and the street was deserted. No children playing ball or skipping rope, no mother figures at the doors, no father figures returning from work. In the same window of each house was a light, and as Meg walked down the street, all the lights were extinguished simultaneously. Was it because of her presence, or was it simply that it was time for lights out? She felt numb, beyond rage or disappointment or even fear. She put one foot ahead of the other with precise regularity, not allowing her pace to lag. She was not thinking. She was not planning. She was simply walking slowly but steadily toward the city and the domed building where it lay. Now she approached the outlying buildings of the city. In each of them was a vertical line of light, but it was a dim, eerie light, not the warm light of stairways in cities at home. And there was no isolated, brightly lit windows where someone was working late on an office, or an office being cleaned. Out of each building came one man, perhaps a watchman, and each man started walking the width of the building. They appeared not to see her. At any rate, they paid no attention to her whatsoever, and she went on past them. What have I got that it hasn't got? She thought suddenly. What have I possibly got? Now, she was walking by the tallest of the business buildings. More dim vertical lines of light, the walls glowed slightly to give a faint illumination to the streets. Central intelligence was ahead of her. Was the man with the red eyes still sitting there? Or was he allowed to go to bed? But this was not where she must go. Though the man with the red eyes seemed the kind old gentleman he claimed to be when compared with it, but he was no longer of any consequence to the search for Charles Wallace. She must go directly to it. It isn't used to being resisted. Father said that's how he managed, and how Calvin and I managed as long as we did. Father saved me then. There's nobody here to save me now. I have to do it myself. I have to resist it by myself. Is that what I have that it hasn't got? No, I'm sure it can resist. It just isn't used to having other people resist. Central intelligence blocked with its huge rectangle the end of the square. She turned to walk around it, and almost her steps slowed. It was not far to the great dome which housed it. I'm going to Charles Wallace. That's what's important. That's what I have to think of. Oh, I wish I could feel numb again the way that I did at first. Suppose it has him somewhere else. Suppose he isn't even there. I have to go there first anyhow. That's the only way that I can find out. Her steps got slower and slower as she passed the great bronze doors. the huge slabs of the Central Intelligence Building, as she finally saw ahead of her the strange light pulsing dome of it. Father said that it was all right for me to be afraid. He said to go ahead and be afraid. And Mrs. Who said, I don't understand what she said, but I think it was meant to make me not hate being only me, and me being the way that I am. And Mrs. Watson said to remember that she loves me. That's what I have to think about, not about being afraid or not as smart as it. Mrs. Watson loves me. You know, that's quite something to be loved by someone like Mrs. Watson. And she was there. No matter how slowly her feet had taken her at the end, they had taken her there. Directly ahead of her was the circular building, its walls glowing with violet flame, its silvery roof pulsing with a light that seemed to Meg to be insane. Again, she could feel the light, neither warm nor cold, but reaching out to touch her, pulling her toward it. There was a sudden sucking, and she was within. It was as though the wind had been knocked out of her. She gasped for breath in her own rhythm, not the permeating pulsing of it. She could feel the beat within her body, controlling her heart, her lungs, but not herself, not Meg. It did not quite have her. She blinked her eyes rapidly and against the rhythm until the redness before them was cleared and she could see. There was the brain, there was it, lying, pulsing and quivering on the dais, soft and exposed and nauseating. Charles Wallace was crouched beside it, his eyes still slowly twirling, his jaw still slack, as she had seen him before, with a tick in his forehead reiterating the revolving and revolting rhythm of it. As she saw him, it was again as though she had been punched in the stomach, for she had to realize afresh that she was seeing Charles, and yet it was not Charles at all. Where was Charles Wallace, her own beloved Charles Wallace? What is it I have got that it hasn't got? You have nothing it hasn't got, Charles Wallace said coldly. How nice to have you back, dear sister. We've been waiting for you. We knew that Mrs. Watson would send you. She is our friend, you know. For an appalling moment, Meg believed, and in that moment she felt her brain being gathered up into it. No, she screamed at the top of her lungs. No, you lie! For a moment she was free from its clutches again. As long as I can stay angry enough, it can't get me. Is that what I have that it doesn't have? Nonsense, Charles Wallace said. You have nothing that it doesn't have. You're lying, she replied, and she felt only anger toward this boy who was not Charles Wallace at all. No, it was not anger. It was loathing. It was hatred, sheer and unadulterated, and as she became lost in hatred, she also began to be lost in it. The red miasma swam before her eyes. Her stomach churned in its rhythm. Her body trembled with the strength of hatred and the strength of it. With the last vestige of consciousness, she jerked her mind and body. Hate was nothing that it didn't have. It knew all about hate. You are lying about that. You are lying about Mrs. Watson, she screamed. Mrs. Watson hates you, Charles Wallace said. And that was where it made its fatal mistake. For as Meg said automatically, Mrs. Watson loves me. That's what she told me, that she loves me. And suddenly she knew. She knew. Love. That's what she had that it did not have. She had Mrs. Watson's love, and her father's and her mother's and the real Charles Wallace's love and the twins and Aunt Beast's, and she had love for them. But how could she use it? What was she meant to do? If she could give love to it, perhaps it would shrivel up and die, for she was sure that it could not withstand love, but she, in all her weakness and foolishness and baseness and nothingness, was incapable of loving it. Perhaps it was not too much to ask of her, but she could not do it. But she could love Charles Wallace. She could stand there and she could love Charles Wallace, her own Charles Wallace, the real Charles Wallace, the child for whom she'd come back to Camazotz, to it, the baby who was so much more than she was and who was yet so utterly vulnerable. She could love Charles Wallace. Charles. Charles, I love you. My baby brother who always takes care of me. Come back to me, Charles Wallace. Come away from it. Come back. Come home. I love you, Charles. Charles Wallace, I love you. Tears were streaming down her cheeks, but she was unaware of them. Now she was even able to look at him, at this animated thing that was not her own Charles Wallace at all. She was able to look and love. I love you, Charles Wallace. You are my darling and my dear and the light of my life and the treasure of my heart. I love you, I love you, I love you. Slowly his mouth closed. Slowly his eyes stopped their twirling. The tick in the forehead ceased its revolting twitch. Slowly he advanced toward her. I love you, she cried. I love you, Charles, I love you. Then, suddenly, he was running, pelting. He was in her arms. He was shrieking with sobs. Meg, 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 I love you, Charles, she cried again, her sobs almost as loud as his, her tears mingling with his. I love you, I love you. A whirl of darkness, an icy cold blast, an angry, resentful howl that seemed to tear through her. Darkness again. Through the darkness to save her came a sense of Mrs. Watson's presence, so that she knew it could not be it who now had her in its clutches. And then the feel of earth beneath her, of something in her arms, and she was rolling over on the sweet-smelling autumnal earth, and Charles Wallace was crying out, Meg, oh Meg! Now she was hugging him close to her, and his little arms were clasped tightly around her neck. Meg, you saved me, he said over and over. Meg, came a call, and there were her father and Calvin, hurrying through the darkness toward them. Still holding Charles, she struggled to stand up and look around. Father, Cal, where are we? Charles Wallace, holding her hand tightly, was looking around too, and suddenly he laughed, his own sweet, contagious laugh. We're in the twins' vegetable garden, and we landed in the broccoli. Meg began to laugh too. At the same time that she was trying to hug her father, to hug Calvin, and not to let go of Charles Wallace for 1 second. Meg, you did it, Calvin shouted. You saved Charles. I am very proud of you, my daughter. Mr. Murray kissed her gravely, then turned toward the house. Now I must go in to Mother. Meg could tell that he was trying to control his anxiety and eagerness. Look, she pointed to the house, and there were the twins and Mrs. Murray walking toward them through the long, wet grass. First thing tomorrow, I must get new glasses, Mr. Murray said, squinting in the moonlight, and then starting to run toward his wife. Dennis's voice came crossly over the lawn. Meg, it's bedtime! And Sandy suddenly yelled, Father! Mr. Murray was running across the lawn, Mrs. Murray running toward him, and they were in each other's arms, and then there were a tremendous happy jumble of arms and legs and hugging, the older Murrays and Meg and Charles Wallace and the twins and Calvin grinning by them until Meg reached out and pulled him in, and Mrs. Murray gave him a special hug all of his own, and they were talking and laughing all at once when they were startled by a crash. And Fortinbras, who could bear being left out of the happiness not 1 second longer, catapulted his sleek black body right through the screen door to the kitchen. He dashed across the lawn to join in on the joy and almost knocked them all over with the exuberance of his greeting. Meg knew all at once Mrs. Watson, Mrs. Who, and Mrs. Witch must be near, because all through her she felt a flooding of joy and love that was even greater and deeper than the joy and love which were already there. She stopped laughing and listened, and Charles listened too. Hush. Then there was a whirring, and suddenly Mrs. Watson, Mrs. Who, and Mrs. Witch were standing in front of them, and the joy and love were so tangible that Meg felt that if she only knew where to reach, she could touch it with her bare hands. Mrs. Watson said, Oh, my darlings, I'm sorry we don't have time to say goodbye to you properly. You see, we have to, but they never learned what it was that Mrs. Watson, Mrs. Who, and Mrs. Witch had to do, for there was a gust of wind, and they were gone. And that's the end of the book. I hope you liked it. And remember, today's focus is to write if you think the author did a good job with the story elements, or if you think the author could have done better. And with that, I will see you with our next book.